Kia ora, everyone who is watching, and welcome to the finals of Cinnamon Scroll 2020 by the University of Auckland. The motion that is being debated in the final is that we would abolish parliament, that we would abolish elections and appoint parliament by lottery. I repeat, that we would abolish elections and appoint parliament by lottery. We have two excellent composite teams hailing from Australia competing in today's final. On the affirming side, we have a speaker from Macquarie University, Ben Jackson. We have a speaker from the University of Sydney. Sorry, is that you, Jeremiah, who's from University of Sydney?
Absolutely not. I'm from UOW.
It's Jeremiah from UOW and Aaron from the University of Sydney. And on the negating team, we have Seamus from the University of Sydney, Oliver from the University of Sydney, and Amrit from the Australian National University. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome the first speaker of the affirming team to open the case that stands in their name.
All right, can everyone hear me? Awesome. The sad reality is that political systems based around a system of elections fail the most basic test of what a democracy should seek to look like, and that is that they do not produce legislatures which are representative of the populations that they seek to govern. When 80% of the population wants action on climate change, but the vast majority of jurisdictions around the world fail to see any real action towards phasing out fossil fuels, when women, people of color, people from low socioeconomic backgrounds are absolutely disproportionately not represented in these institutions, when legislative bodies like the United States Congress, for instance, have a 15% approval rating after the people have literally just been elected in the most recent midterms, that is obviously a system which is failing, and side affirmative in this debate uniquely reforms that system. I'm going to start this debate with some setup to make it very clear what our model is. Firstly, we're electing legislatures which are very large. So to put this into perspective, in countries like Australia, for instance, we have about one representative for every maybe 120 people. In our world, we would have representatives for maybe one in every 20,000 people. These would be massive bodies, which means the likelihood of distortion, so the likelihood of it not looking like the population that it represents, is immensely low. Secondly, no thank you. Once these people serve once, they can never serve again, so it's a one-time thing. Thirdly, we would set precise rules of who can get into this parliament and who can't. So firstly, if anybody can prove that they have good reason that this is going to massively disrupt their life, so for instance, they're like business owner and it's going to be a massive disruption, and they can prove that, then they can opt out. Secondly, for individuals who, have proven via, some crime that they've committed, they can't be trusted with other people's money, that would also be somebody who we would bar from this. Fourthly, we would have, terms probably around 4 or 5 years long, consistent with what jurisdictions look like now. But at the end of those terms have 6-month crossover periods where half of that legislature, where the new legislature is phased in, they can do things like learn the ropes of governing, make decisions about who is to be elected to executives. I'll take it if it's a point of clarification. If it's a point of information, I won't. Cool. I'm going to give you 3 pieces of substantive material in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to explain why structurally, elections always lead to unrepresentative bodies. And the reason why I'm giving this is that this is going to establish why the status quo is untenably bad, and you need some reform to the system which does not involve elections of representatives. Firstly, elections require some level of financial capital to be able to, compete in that election. You need to do things like hire officers, so hire staff members, hire advertisements. Television advertisements are very expensive. And that locks out groups in society who cannot amass these funds, who are disproportionately, poorer people, people of color, women, other, disadvantaged people in society. They get locked out of even being able to compete in these elections in many jurisdictions. Secondly, there's problems with nepotism. So a lot of voters vote based on name recognition. So there was a whole group of people in the USA, for instance, who voted for Jeb Bush in the Republican primary in 2016, only on the fact that they had, fond memories of the George Bush era, right? You have the ability to just get elected based on the name that you have. Thirdly, the internal pre-selection structures of parties are flawed. Many parties have, things like branch stacking, where special interest groups have the ability to basically choose who gets nominated and who gets parachuted into like safe districts and basically get to choose the makeup of parliament without any real choice given to voters. Fourthly, many jurisdictions have cultures of political apathy where electoral incentives, like the ones which side negative might seek to, champion in this debate, do not work because people in society outside of election times, often forget about the poor decisions which members of parliament make and do not vote on that when the next time comes around. Fifthly, we think many jurisdictions have things like gerrymandering and voter fraud, which also poisons the electoral process. Sixthly, we think that having electoral bodies oftentimes leads to individuals staying in power for long periods of time, more than just one term. And that has a whole host of problems. That firstly, you get brainwashed into a culture of governance. So you only have to look at people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the United States, who upon being elected into parliament was viewed as an outsider, who called Nancy Pelosi her enemy, but now he's doing things like calling Pelosi like the mama bear of the Democratic Party. People get, secondly, you have the ability of special interests to capture these politicians when they know they're going to be around for a long time by donating to their election campaigns. We get rid of all of that in a world where we don't even have elections, because elections is what necessarily causes that. So, I'll take a point, Sean.
Who is easier for special interest groups to capture? An individual who has a steady job in parliament and at the end of the day is accountable to the public, or a random stranger who can probably be bought off for $1,000?
It is much easier to, buy off people who are elected representatives. And that's for a few reasons. The first reason is the one which I just gave, which is that often the way this buying off works is not that literally you can bribe the politician, right? There's laws against that. It's that you donate to their election campaign. And that is something which allows them to understand, without any quid pro quo, that they should work in your interest. You get rid of that when they don't have an election campaign. So secondly, in this speech, why do we think elections themselves are bad? So this is the process of elections, not the legislatures which they represent. Firstly, in legislatures where you have compulsory voting, the policy making which happens is like it appeals to the median swing voter, as opposed to trying to be good for everyone in that democracy, because those are the people that determine elections with compulsory voting. With non-compulsory voting, people only try to get their base out and don't try to reach out to broad swaths of society. So you get bad policy in that instance. Secondly, elections have large amounts of mudslinging, attack ads, which oftentimes lead to racist and sexist attacks, which is why incidences of hate crimes skyrocket during election periods. Thirdly, you get pork barreling where people misuse taxpayer money and do things like, the recent sports rort in Australia, where members of the Liberal Party were doing things like putting money directly into swing districts to try to help their re-election chances. We get rid of that when we don't have elections. Thirdly, why do we think lotteries will produce competent leaders? Firstly, because statistically, due to the law of large numbers, they're going to be representative. The chance that you have large amounts of people from different backgrounds with different amounts of knowledge. No, thank you. No, I don't have time. With different amounts of knowledge and is going to be incredibly high. You're going to get statistically a body which does represent the wants of people, and importantly, which statistically has large amounts of different knowledge bases, which means you are going to be able to have collaborative decision making, which is informed. But secondly, these people are going to have things like advisors. They are going to be able to gauge what the general public wants by looking at things at structures and institutions like the media. And we're also happy to do things like impose restrictions on who these advisors can be, so that they can't advise these non-elected representatives to help the advisors' financial interests. At the end of this point, and at the end of this speech, what have we given you very clearly from the start of this debate? Firstly, a detailed characterization of why systems which rely on elections always lead to bad policy and an unrepresentative legislative system. And secondly, we've given you a clear comparison between the status quo and what our lottery system looks like, and explained why we believe these leaders are going to be competent and going to be addressing all the problems which I outlined earlier in this speech. Very, very proud to affirm.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce my panelists. The first, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, is Grace Bellworthy from both the University of Otago and the University of Auckland at this stage. Secondly, we have two judges from the University of Canterbury, Rebecca Frankham and Nick Wilson. And then finally, we are joined by a judge from Victoria University, Siobhan Davies. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the first speaker of the negating team.
I'm going to open this speech with a really boring debating observation, which is just that the affirmative team in this debate have exhausted an enormous amount of fiat. Yeah? People like democracy. People really like democracy. They have revolutions so they can have democracy. So to upturn a democracy entirely requires an enormous amount of political capital. So the question you should ask yourself is not, do democracies need fixing? It is, with the enormous amount of political capital available to both teams, how ought we fix those democracies? What do we support? We support quotas at all levels of parliament. We support things like having aldermen at local councils, but we also support having a disproportionately high representation for minority groups, like Indigenous Australians in Australia or trans individuals in the United States, for example. Secondly, we also support changing the way that we operate with small parties. So we give them more money, we give them greater representation and greater say in the Senate. And thirdly, we also support strong measures against corruption, the kinds of things that the leader of the, well, I suppose the first affirmative speaker had such a problem with. For example, like doing what the Australian Electoral Commission did in Australia to combat gerrymandering by giving states far less power to draw those lines in the first place, or for example, by stopping the influence of big money in politics by having additional watchdogs and additional transparency. And you only need to think how much stuff is available to us on our side of the house to solve almost all of the problems that the affirmative team have identified thus far. Let's start with the principle, then we'll talk about who gets the best governance, then we'll talk about political engagement. The essence of this principle is simple, which is the principle that underlies democracy is not one of representation, but one of accountability. The affirmative team's model removes the degree of accountability necessary in order for a government to have legitimacy. That is because the government wields an enormous amount of power over you. They get to decide what you can and cannot do, and they can exercise violence in order to make you do those things. And you did not consent to that system in any meaningful way. And the reason we have this system, which is in some ways principally, questionable, is because it is a very convenient system to have. There are very few other systems we can opt into to allow this to happen. So the solution to this unfortunate convenience that we have all arrived at is holding governments to account by allowing the population to vote them in and out, and having things like, for example, local elections, where you decide, well, that person who wields power over me has wielded it in the wrong way, so we will not have that person in power anymore. And at the point where you remove that accountability, the government loses all of its legitimacy. And this has two conclusions. Firstly, very obviously, you shouldn't be able to govern in this way. If I could, for example, take Ben Jackson and be his life coach and force him to do all the things I wanted him to do, I'm sure he would have a better life. But that would be an enormously immoral and illegitimate way for me to exercise my power. Secondly, and the practical outcome of this is due to people's lack of respect for the legitimacy of government anymore, you're going to end up with far more instability. Like, imagine how this takes place in poor developing nations where these democracies are already at risk of backslides. You get riots, you get more opportunities for fascist leaders to take the reins and take power. All these guys do is wear away at countries' abilities to have democracies in any meaningful instance. Let's talk about governance next. We have 4 reasons why the current system leads to far better governance than the system that side opposition would support. Firstly, there are no strong accountability mechanisms under their system, which leads to 2 conclusions. Yeah. Firstly, they can just do whatever is in their own self-interest. And that doesn't just look like doing things like, not voting for climate change. That looks like things like distorting entire financial systems to benefit themselves and themselves alone. It looks like things like voting for policies based on how it would directly impact them, as opposed to any constituents who might be able to hold them to account through things like elections, through things like the media. But secondly, it also leads to an enormous amount of corruption. And the affirmative team's response to this POI that I give them is just to say, no, the problem with money in politics is that elections require that money. So if you take the elections away, it's not required. But when you have thousands upon thousands of elected officials, you cannot possibly monitor all of them. Bribes will happen, and you only need to look at developing nations where there aren't strong accountability measures around that to see the influence that will have. And that will distort the process far more, because you can directly compel people to do things, whereas in the past you could only encourage them to do so through election donations. Secondly, this will lead to enormous inefficiencies in the political process. Firstly, because of a lack of continuity, and that leads to obvious problems like, policies can't be carried out to their natural conclusion. But also imagine how this impacts government bureaucracies that require, strong predictions of what the government is going to do in order to be able to plan what they are going to do. Secondly, there is no clear chain of leadership or specific responsibility, which was the point of clarification I tried to ask but was rejected. Who's the president in this situation? Yeah. Who's the Minister of Defense? It is unclear who is doing what, and that leads to an enormous problems. And not just in the general ether, it leads to enormous problems in specific times like this when we require strong leadership in order to weather through crises. But thirdly, there's also just an enormous lack of information about who does what. Yeah, you don't know what political allegiances people hold. You don't know what policies people are proposing. And their model of an incredibly large government only makes this far, far worse, because how do you organize yourselves in a way that policy is made at all? Thirdly, the policy would be very bad. That is firstly because of a lack of experience they have drafting the policy at all, leading to a lack of an enormous amount of errors, but also because secondly, they have a far lesser degree of information, both because of the fact they haven't been in Parliament for very long, but also because they don't have access to things like policy writers that parties have, like technocrats who can support them. But thirdly, it's also just for the very trivial reason that they're probably just not as sharp as a lot of politicians. Like politicians have to be smart to get your vote. Yeah, like they have to have some ability to maneuver the party ranks and get people to vote for them. And the average Joe is probably not going to be as smart as them and make as good a policy. Fourthly, let's talk about representation, because these guys are just like, you get an accurate portrayal of representation of minority groups in the public. That's not sufficient. If trans people are accurately represented in Parliament, there'll never be a policy for a trans person ever again. Yeah, they're just too small of a population proportion. Our quotas problem fixes that enormously. Finally, let's talk about engagement. It is incredibly important to have a population that is engaged with politics, yeah? Because in the absence of that, the government almost has no accountability whatsoever. People don't care what happens, people don't know what they should think happens, and the problem with this system is in the absence of elections, that is all but certain to happen. Firstly, because the process of elections is hugely informative, and the first affirmative speaker is like, no, actually, it's just constant mudslinging. Some of it is, yeah, but it's also the greatest wealth of political knowledge that most people are going to be exposed to on their day-to-day basis. Ben, what do you got?
The vast majority of the time of elected officials is not spent on the high-minded work of governance or anything like that. It is mostly spent on trying to secure re-election, which incorporates things like, for example, attempting to make sure that you have enough fundraisers and attempting to make sure that you spend enough time with your constituents. Don't you think the sheer labor cost involved in that is enormous enough to outweigh many of the consequences of inefficiency?
The first thing that I would identify is, even if you believe that point of information to its totality, it is almost totally unimportant. Yeah, our case explains why government would not be able to function in any meaningful way. That explains why parties who would be generating excess revenue in their world, in our world, just allocate that differently. Secondly, it's not true for the reason that elected officials don't spend their entire time electioneering. They spend an enormous amount of time on policy, and then once every 4 years spend a 6 months period on elections where they also do their job at the same time. The second reason why you get less engagement from the public is because people do not any longer feel like they have any ability to influence politics and therefore have no reason to get engaged in politics. And finally, because you remove the incentive of political parties to inform the public about policies and inform them about what they ought to believe. Their world, seriously, is fucking insane. Parties have no right to do this to individuals. People will riot, there will be backslides into fascism, and even in their best case scenario, they end up with the world's most inefficient government that doesn't help anyone.
Kia ora, thank you very much. I would like to welcome the second speaker of the affirming team.
Can people hear me? Cool, thank you. Let's be clear. It doesn't matter how much affirmative action you're going to implement, you still have people who are beholden to interests of re-election, people who are beholden to the very, very yummy taste of being captured by corporations and incredibly, perverse special interest groups. I think it doesn't matter where you are on the chain or in the chain of society, people are still capable of being corrupted over time. And this is the model to get rid of that completely. Three issues in this speech. Firstly, on the principle, the question I'll ask here is who's more representative, i.e. which side is more democratic? Ollie kind of gets the definition of democracy wrong when he says, well, democracy is about accountability and stuff. No, democracy is about the people having power, meaning that if we get rid of the status quo, which is that only the most privileged and only the most powerful are capable of getting re-elected, it therefore means that it is democratic insofar as it is insofar there's a lottery. That's why the Greeks had lotteries for their democracy, and you would probably say they probably had some kind of democracy. The next thing that they kind of say is that, well, our side is still pretty representative. The status quo is super fine insofar as you are capable of voting for people and keeping them to account. That's a lie, because gerrymandering exists under your side. You also have people who become servants to special interest groups. You don't get rid of that incentive. Even people who are trans, even people who are from minority groups are capable of having that kind of incentive being put on them. No, and you also get rid of the ability for minorities to still enter, because it is still only the most powerful people in those AA sections that are capable of entering power. I think that you fail your own principle in this debate, but I don't think that it is a very good principle either. They then say, well, random Joes can be bought off, and special interest groups still have power in our world, and there's no accountability in our world. 3 responses. Firstly, we obviously think people still care about their country. So, the average Joe, yes, is perhaps average, but he still cares about being able to provide good outcomes for his country. That looks like trade, and that also looks like, getting better social welfare policies. We think it's the same like jury duty. People care about a proper and good outcome. It doesn't matter if perhaps they might have some obscure interests that they might have later down the line. It does not mean that they do not care about outcomes for their society. The second response is to say that people are still accountable, even when they are chosen by lottery. They're accountable to the people by mechanisms of the media, and also by the fact that they still have to re-enter society, meaning that if you institute some sort of really terrible policy, you are going to have to face the wrath of the people and the community that you go back to. It is very likely that these people are going to go with the interests of their group to parliament, meaning that we get still some accountability under our side. The difference between our accountability and their accountability is that their accountability is subject to elections which are prone to gerrymandering, and elections who are also prone to only favoring the most powerful. That's the difference between our accountability. Ours is better. Third response on average Joes, we think our side is still comparatively better, even if it is true that there is no accountability, because your elections suck for all the reasons I told you, Aaron told you, which was that it was only the most powerful, and it was subject to gerrymandering. I'll take a point of information.
Yeah, it's a point of clarification, and it's the same one I was going to ask Aaron. Again, how in your world is the president decided? What's the leadership structure in this mythical universe?
Okay, so I will respond to that in my second issue when I talk about why we get quality policy. Onto the next thing that they claim onto representation, they say, oh, we have enough political capital for AA. Well, I'm not sure about this, but even if it was true that you had all that political capital, firstly, this doesn't work, because obviously I told you for the same reasons why, your elections suck, that it's only the most privileged of those classes that still get in. But secondly, you don't even get your own version of democracy, because you corrupt your version of democracy so much, that is that you erode the choice that people in society have. That means that you must choose from a selection of trans people. That necessarily means that you don't get your version of accountability. The next thing that they say is, well, people don't consent to this system. That's symmetric. No one consented to people who get into power for no reason. For example, Donald Trump, who lost the popular vote. They then say, well, really small demographics that excluded, for example, trans people. Obviously, we can expand these legislatures to include a larger sample size of society. That is to say that now, if trans people compose 1% of the population, it is likely that now you will have that, represented kind of in your legislature. The next issue is about policy. Who gets quality policy? And I'll respond to the stuff about the prime minister. They firstly say, well, what did they say? They said, oh, there's no executive, you don't have a prime minister and all that. Well, obviously people in this system will presumably elect an executive and they would have to decide on a majority vote. And like, you know, you would have a minister of defense and a minister of state. And I don't really think you need a prime minister, because a prime minister is only useful insofar as giving media conferences. You can just have a media of defense or media of health to do those conferences that pertain to their section of society. And we think that, like, insofar as we do that, we're capable of having some sort of executive structure. They then say, in terms of policy, well, you know, there's lack of continuity. Firstly, obviously our accountability mechanism keeps people to account of, like, in terms of continuity. You need only like scroll up to my earlier material to tell you why we still have accountability, to be able to note that this is still capable of happening. That is to say, when a road gets built, it will continue to be built. And notably, if a road's being built and you stop halfway, that sounds to me like something that you could get in really big trouble for when you leave this parliament. And note that you can't re-elect yourself to now re-enter the fray. We think that you are likely going to still continue building that road, and yeah, it doesn't matter. But the second thing to say is that our model literally makes this like irrelevant, because our model says a 6-month period, meaning that the new lottery people are going to like be inside the legislature. They're not going to vote the same way that the current legislature does, but they're going to be able to be part of those like offices to see how the legislature at that point is governing society. So we think that that phasing period gets rid of that argument. They then say in quality of policy that no, they're not technocrats, and these people are stupid. Firstly, obviously people have incentives to have advisors and do the right thing when it comes to creating policy. Secondly, you don't need to be Machiavellian and Frank Underwood to be a competent politician. There are a litany of good politicians that are very good faith that are capable of running this country. Thirdly, your politicians are also stupid. You have people in Australia like Malcolm Roberts, who doesn't believe that climate change is real. You also have people like Sarah Hanson-Young, who believes that Snow Patrol is an actual patrol when instead it was a TV show. You do not have competent politicians either. Ours is more competent. Why? Firstly, because it's 50% of the population now that are women. 50% of the population are women are now entering society, so entering this legislature. So it's 50% women, and it's also more people believing in climate action as well, noting that 60% of the population is in favor of that. Third issue on social signal. This will respond to Ollie's stuff about political engagement. Insofar as you know that you could possibly enter power, that is to say there's no longer an insignificant chance that you can't enter power, that means that you are likely to learn about politics now and ensure that you educate yourself before entering that. That means people engage with that. That means people write to their members of parliament that have been chosen to lottery. Here is my 2 cents. I think that you could do it this way. And also, people want to know these things, because what if they get in and they're found like as deer in headlights? It is very likely that these people are going to be engaged in politics. Secondly, it means that people are going to be more confident about the way in which their own system, their own group functions, because now it is no longer just this rich and powerful who enter power. It is now the people who are minorities who were originally alienated. At the conclusion of this speech, our model was most principally acceptable, theirs was not.
Kia ora, thank you very much. I would like to welcome the second speaker of the negating team.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello, human beings? Yep, all right, cool. The problem with this affirmative team is that they engage with a democracy that we do not prop in this debate, yeah? Because given the frame that Ollie presents in this debate and the amount of political capital you have, the problems that they have in this debate immediately go away. Things like gerrymandering that are a result of politicians having control in the legislature. Things like, for example, political disclosure or like not having a cap are a result of us having a lack of political capital. If it is true, you can scrap away democracy and people are willing to take the chance, like whatever the chances are in the lottery, we will think that we were able to implement this, which is to say we get rid of the large problems they speak about things like political capture by richer individuals, things like, for example, political parties pandering to these individuals. I am not sure why it is exactly the same. They haven't given us a reason for why our system does not work or why the fiat does not apply. If they don't do this by the end of this debate, they have lost the comparison. So the first thing I want to talk about is whether or not we think there is more or less corruption and accountability within the system. Then I'll talk about the principle, then I'll talk about representation and the political makeup and the political landscape as a result of this. The first thing I want to talk about is with regards to corruption and financial capture. This is ridiculous to the degree that we can fiat and say we can do things like reforms. Obviously, that is not absolute, and we do have some degree of financial capture. This is uncomparative for a couple of reasons. First is, obviously, we think that election, getting re-elected or being a campaign politician, being in a political party is obviously the strongest incentive for you to be accountable, in that people aren't going to vote for you in the next election if you take bribes from a foreign government. If it is true that you are getting politically captured by, for example, huge amounts of like oil lobby in an era where more and more people are becoming pro climate change, it becomes exceptionally hard, because that is the accountability mechanism. Their response here was just, people still care about their country, so they won't take money. That's ridiculous. Do you know how beautiful cash handouts are in the developing world to fuck people over to do things that are against their interests? People also don't have the capacity to make meaningful choices. Through them, they might be doing what's good to their country, but they'll be taking $1,000 and they'll probably do shit for it. Obviously, we think the accountability mechanism that they present here is ridiculous. The accountability mechanism here was, you would face the wrath of a community. What? Like, for starters, you're not getting reelected, so fuck. The community can get angry for like an election season. Then they have the next group of people to worry about. You would have gotten all the benefits of like making policies for your, like for you and your community. Obviously, we think this accountability mechanism is shit. The second is, where there is a lottery system that exists, and people are probably not going to get elected, or like it's very rare that they get elected. It is obviously just true that there's high amounts of apathy. Look at the analysis Ollie gives you about buy-in and why more and more individuals are going to get are not going to be engaged in politics to the same degree, because they feel like they have very little control. They might be engaged once they get elected, but before that, because it is so random and people like don't know if they're going to get elected, you don't get the benefits that they speak about. So it is not true in this debate that they have the accountability mechanisms that we do. We think they have higher amounts of corruption and things that they can't control. We think re-election is obviously the best way to do this. This is coupled with the fiat that we give you and political capital. We think for those reasons, the problems they speak about in democracy are absolutely bullshit. The second thing I want to talk about is the principle in this debate. Yeah, they kind of go, people don't have power in the status quo, and obviously we think the lottery system returns the power to these individuals. I have a couple of things to say about this. The first thing I want to say is with regards to what this representation looks like you can have a large group or like a large parliament, and you have gotten people into office. This is the best case scenario for them. But large parliaments, the current parliaments go into political gridlock all the time. Yeah, we don't agree on each other. That's with election and like the possibility of re-election where you have to compromise. Imagine a world in which you don't get re-elected. This is a random group of people. Obviously, we think this does absolutely nothing. It's probably quite tokenistic. The second thing to note is obviously we think this is not an assured thing. In a world in which minorities make very small populations, you don't get the same like consistency of individuals. What's the comparison here? A couple of comparisons we have here. The first is obviously in a world in which there are minority politicians, they do things like they invigorate their voter base, so you get secure like African Americans for areas that are African American, for example. It is also true that a lot of communities are able to do things like concentrate their like spending into one particular person to get them elected. That ensures continuity for the communities. Things like policies for African Americans or trans individuals are more likely to happen in our world. You getting them once or twice every 5 elections is obviously not the same level of representation. We think we would prefer that. Their response here was just, oh, but quotas are undemocratic. What about that? Yeah, all right, okay, let me explain how quotas work. Yeah, in some countries the way quotas work is that you have like 5% for like indigenous populations. The highest like voted person gets that particular portion. But second is democracies have some exceptions. For example, we allow things like technocracy, like the Federal Reserve is controlled by people who are not elected. But obviously, we think by and large, it is represented by a democracy. So it's not the same degree in this debate. So you can't just muddle up our principle as a result of this. So at this point in this debate, I've proven we have better accountability mechanisms to prevent things like corruption, ensure more representation, and their policy does not ensure huge amounts of like representation for the people they care about. The second thing I want to talk about in this debate is policy making. This is absolutely ridiculous. For the reasons I have given you earlier for why the accountability mechanisms are bad, it is obviously true as a result of that you don't get huge amounts of policies that are very good. What is the incentives of individuals? Considering you are the person got elected, maybe like one election you got elected, you are not going to get into parliament any other time after this. You have no control over the future individuals. You don't know if they're going to do what's good for you, what's bad for you. That obviously incentivizes people to defer to what is best for them to ensure that they come out of this looking good. So they will cop if there is any public backlash, because they know that they have no control in the future, which means you will get policies that are either a short term, which means you don't get the bridge that is incomplete according to Jeremiah. You just literally get you get none of those things. You get these individuals protecting themselves, or which is more likely, is you don't get policy continuity, which are things like reforms on climate change, things like, for example, like reforms on like the banking industry, for example, are things that require long periods of time to establish, and governments that have an incentive to do so. You remove that incentive and you make people more likely to privilege themselves. This is to say that you have individuals who are also quite bad, right, at running this policy. They were like, we will just elect who the fucking defense minister is. But people run elections in campaigns with political parties, with people that they know are going to run in specific roles that they were going to run into. Obviously, we think that's not the same as randomly putting a person there. They probably didn't want to be in that position anyway. Or we think your policy actually makes the election season far worse. Before I go on to that, yeah. You're off.
Sorry. So the problem with even affirmative action is that people are spending more than one term in power. So that means that even minorities are capable of being susceptible to corporate capture and also susceptible to perverse interests.
Yeah, okay, you're not dealing with any of the stuff I said earlier, not the comparison and representation, not explaining why your policy is like comparatively better in terms of getting them into office for a sustainable amount. So that doesn't work. The next thing I want to talk about, which gets like absolutely zero response, is with regards to buying into the election system. Obviously, we think this policy disproportionately impacts the developing world. Yeah, it is obviously true that there is like very little support for institutions like the courts, institutions like the president's office to do things like implement policies in order for individuals like in the rural areas to get things like infrastructure, a point at which is a random lottery. You incentivize things. I'm not even exaggerating this. Things like race riots, things like ensuring that you hurt individuals so when they get into office, they're scared of you. Those kind of things destabilize countries insanely. I'm not going to talk about the economic and social impacts as a result of this, which means you get huge amounts of opposition to like democracy and the system, and then you allow backsliding in the worst instances into autocracy. Yeah. So we think those systems are obviously in place for a reason. We think screwing over them makes it far worse for these reasons. The last thing I want to talk about is just with regards to pre-election, because obviously a lot of information that exists leads to public debate on information, that things like the changed Overton window, for example, those things are massively reduced, and it means that people are less informed, which means every election, people are just reversing the mistakes of their previous person, so it becomes far worse. For those reasons, I beg you to oppose.
Kia ora, thank you so much. I would like to welcome the third speaker of the affirming team.
Cool, cool, cool. I may turn this off, as happy as it makes me. Can I be heard? Good, good. You know, the secret to modern politics is the most politicians suck. The structures that Aaron described to you in his first speaker speech are not attractive ones for most normal people to enter into. And we know this by the quality of people that put themselves up for election, the quality of people that stand for election and so forth. They're not people with any diverse life experience. And that's kind of inherent, because in order to survive inside of political machines, you need to have been working inside of political machines for a very long time. They have a narrow band that involves campaigning and working in politics. And there are, of course, people that are attracted to power, that life's goals are built around the acquisition and the maintenance of power. And what that means is that these people do what they know and what they want to do. They focus on elections, they focus on re-election. And that is where the problem that Aaron tells you about, which is never really fixed in this debate, associated with elections come about, that you appeal to the wrong set of base impulses, that you don't spend time working on policy, that you don't pursue a policy that is representative of the wills of people, because it might affect, you know, like some small group of the population, as we saw happen when it comes to gay marriage. And of course, you don't want to ever piss off corporations. I'm going to look at three things in this speech: the opposition's fiat, the principle, and then most importantly, the various consequences that this brings about. Firstly, on the opposition's fiat, the opposition's counterprop is one that seeks to avoid the burden of defending anything close to a democracy as we are familiar with it in the world as it stands. And good faith efforts to introduce those in previous parts of the world have failed, for a relatively simple reason, that the people that are entrusted with the maintenance of those laws are also the people that stand to benefit from their degradation. For example, their example of New South Wales with gerrymandering laws is a really good one, because of course we instituted those laws, but those laws have been substantially weakened. And in fact, my understanding, although I probably could not say this like formally, is that a member of parliament who used to sit in the seat of Wallandilly has largely stacked them out. This is just to say that there is a difference between having a structural change that means that the people that are put in charge of the maintenance of these structures are the ones that we describe, as opposed to their imposed policies, which need to be continuously upheld and reaffirmed by those who hold power and have an incentive to dilute them because they dilute their power. The other thing, of course, to say though, no, thank you, Amrit, is I don't really think the opposition has made their political capital arguments sufficiently. They were just like, democracy is very popular. Now, I think to a degree, the way you perceive this argument is influenced by the legitimacy argument, which I will do now. That is just to say that legitimacy is a conduit in part to whether or not it is perceived as in fact legitimate by the populations that live under it. So let us go through that now on legitimacy. We are of the belief that there are multiple bases upon which a government can be legitimate. One, for sure, is accountability, but another is representation. A good example of this is that no one would disagree that a plebiscite is a highly legitimate way for a government to make a decision, even though it is largely an unaccountable one. And that is because it represents the will of the people, not just because it could theoretically be overturned through accountability mechanisms. And we tell you that the law of large numbers guarantees, in a way never contested, that this population has opinions and beliefs largely representative of the general population. And that is why there will not be riots in this debate, for example, because when you have a large mass of people who look like you, and think like the rest of the people in your community making these decisions, they're likely to be regarded as somewhat acceptable, particularly when you consider the comparative in which there is at least an enormous understanding across most of the world that elected parliamentary representatives share the traits that I told you about in my introduction. So I don't necessarily think that this argument fits that burden. But of course, if you did care about representation, we had a suite of responses. Firstly, Aaron shows you substantially that the status quo fails to fix that. And as I showed you in that first issue, they've at least got some of a burden to stand for some of those problems. Secondly, because there is the accountability mechanism of these people returning to their community, which means they'll constantly be thinking about it because they know they're not there for a very long time. Amrit's response to this is to say, but people generally don't care about social approval, which is of course something that maybe Amrit would believe, but I think is an idiosyncratic belief about the way that people behave or the beliefs that people have. Most people care about the validation of their peers. And the final thing is, of course, that Amrit in fact concedes that it is not necessarily crucial to have representation as long as there is some basis for legitimacy. For example, a willingness to over-represent people who are vulnerable. So finally, onto the consequences. But before I get to them, I'll take Amrit.
So obviously it is true that representation becomes better in a world in which people have access to things like control over their legislation and do things like pump individuals. When it is only you once, why wouldn't people have incentive to riot, backslide, and low buy into a system? Because you literally can't opt into it anytime after the first time.
Oh, okay. We can just start there, I suppose. So this is actually quite a simple thing. People now have a good understanding that they have a possibility in the future of participating in government, and people are far more likely to know people that have participated in government, which means government and government representation is far closer by you and a far more tangible proposition. So while you don't get the ability to vote, you have an understanding that you, people from your community, and people very much like you are probably going to be in there, which we think provides a similar basis for understanding and desire for engagement that then means that people are still likely to educate themselves and still likely to participate. As Jerry tells you, to no response. Let's talk about accountability next. The opposition gives two strands of fail. The first is with regards to bribes. Now, we tell you that, of course, this would be illegal. The opposition's response is that it is hard to monitor 2,000 people, which is totally crazy, right? Like if you have 1 in every 10,000 people in your legislature, which is still a relatively large number, it is relatively easy for the police to monitor them, particularly given their finances won't be that complicated because their job is being in the legislature and there's no necessary reason for them to do anything that is that corrupt. But also because the trade-off for them is bad, because once you have accepted a bribe, there is always a risk that you will be caught and you will be probably punished prospectively, and it's difficult to predict the consequences. I think most people will be risk averse. The better version of this argument is the idea that people will vote in their self-interest. Of course, sometimes this is true, but that is good if you have a representative legislature, because all a democracy is a series of people voting in their self-interest. So if people are voting in favor of bills that benefit them personally, right? If you are 1 of 2,000, like if it is a highly idiosyncratic bill, that literally does not matter. If you are like a large mass of people in the legislature, that implies that it is in fact a good bill that ought to be passed. The second thing that we hear is a set of arguments about inefficacy. And I think that this argument ignores the fact, essentially, firstly, that there would be a long period of time before it in which these people got together and figured out who would be there. Secondly, the idea that governments have staff that perform an enormous amount of the execution of these things. Thirdly, the idea that amongst a representative body of the population, there are likely to be some people with management experience or something like that. And fourthly, the idea that people generally tend to be able to, given that this is a large legislature, than is normally the case, will be able to divide jobs amongst themselves. Oh, and of course, fifthly, that we are talking about the legislature and not the executive government. So the priority must definitionally be on the legislative process. The next thing that we hear is the idea that these people are stupid. And to that I say, well, look, Parliament, they're not sending their best at the moment. For all the examples that Jerry gave you about, look, our domestic legislature and stuff like that, it is not clear that the median person is less intelligent. What is, however, clear is that the median person is better, right? They are more moral for the set of reasons. And it's not necessarily clear that if you have a staff that is able to translate many of the policy implications of these things to you, that it would be such a problem for you to be able to vote in a way that is intelligent. I've already rebutted the stuff about representation. People will see themselves in these legislatures and care about them. And that also rebuts all of their material about engagement. People engage more when they perceive these bodies to be nearby them and they care more about them. And to conclude this speech, I think it's just important to retell a simple thing that we all know, which is that the people that join political parties, particularly at our age, are not people that represent the community, and they are the ones that are most likely to accumulate power. In my time in the Liberal Party, which is the New Zealand equivalent of the National Party, there was a huge number of people that I met in that party who were good people who got burnt out and disillusioned by the set of procedures that we tell you about in Aaron's speech. The people that are left in those bodies, the people that are left to make these decisions, are the ones that can take the heat of awful things being done and awful decisions being made, who don't care about the population and who aren't necessarily competent. The future isn't bright, but it might be if we gave everyone a go, and that's why we're so proud to propose.
Kia ora, thank you very much. For the final substantive speech in this debate, I would like to welcome the third negating speaker.
Can you guys hear me okay? Let's start with a very simple question. The 16,500 Americans who now constitute the parliament walk in for their first day. They need to choose a treasurer. Who do you choose? Because presumably a lot of those people have an interest in being the treasurer, and presumably a lot of them put their hands up, and presumably you have to have a long spirited debate where you canvass literally thousands of people. And then you need to extend that over an extraordinarily large sample size for almost every single decision. And you know what? Even when you do get your treasurer, the people who most likely put their hands up were probably white, wealthy people who had some experience in that area. So you didn't get much more of a better election anyway. But even when you did that, you just did not have the accountability that you were describing. First, a question with respect to fiat and our model, then a question with respect to like executive failure. Then we're going to look at the extent to which this has practical issues, and then we're going to look at some other material that is not responded to properly. First, on our model, we tell you a litany of things that we can do, all of which are very reasonable and all of which are based on things that have already been done to some extent. The response firstly comes with respect to, at third, a new attack, saying, well, this isn't a reasonable thing to do for a couple of reasons. The first being that there is no example of what we are describing. And the thing to say there is, no, there's not an example of what we're describing, but maybe, but there's also not an example of what you're describing. There are no states in the world that have their entire parliaments appointed by lotteries. But what we have has much closer analogies. And in fact, one of the things is the Australian electorate laws with respect to gerrymandering, which would have been exceptionally successful and which Ben points to as a bad example, which is ironic. The second thing Ben says is it's in the interest of governments to retain power. Sure, but firstly, that is extraordinarily bad publicity where you have a functioning media. Second, you can lock that power to amend away behind barriers like referenda. And third, you have a risk of the other side abusing that power, like South Carolina abusing those sorts of laws as well. The final Hail Mary with respect to this from Ben is to say, well, you haven't proven this policy is unpopular, but we've spent an enormous amount of time doing that. Because presumably when literally random people are running the country, when you need to canvass 16,500 people's individual votes, all of which might have different opinions and all of whom might want to debate the issue, particularly when it's a hot topic like abortion or a complicated piece of law like the Corporations Act, my God, how do you ever possibly get that done? Which means it is going to be unpopular because people like casting their vote, people like feeling like their decisions matter, and you stripped that from them. So that meant our model worked. The only other attacks are sort of a bit more scattergun, like when Jerry says, well, you only get the most privileged minorities through affirmative action. First, under the status quo, like political parties have electoral incentives to choose genuine people from that background who have experienced that hardship. That's why, for instance, Jackie Lambie was so successful and no thank you, and has been so genuine as a politician, despite the fact that she comes from a disadvantaged background, because there is that exact electoral incentive. But secondly, people from the minorities you're describing are the most likely to self-select out of being in this parliament because they view themselves as being incapable of performing that core function because society says to you, no, you are not capable of doing that. So that means that with respect to RFIAT, we proved that. The only other stuff here is with respect to ideas about it being unpopular, which we've also substantially proven. So that moves us on into the next substantive issue in this debate, which is sort of with respect to executive failure. And this is where almost all of the first affirmative speech falls apart, because almost all of the examples of things that are bad are things that are very fixable and which we've given you a concrete plan of which to fix. And you know what? That probably isn't going to happen in the real world, but neither is what they are suggesting. And if they have the capacity to remove elections and disband political parties, which is not in the interests of, by definition, the most powerful people in society, we get the fiat to do some stuff too. And that meant that all of the stuff they were describing is just irrelevant. The stuff about not having sufficient background checks, the stuff about like monies and things of that nature. Before I continue, Ben. I can't hear you.
Jackie Lambie was popular after winning the most random election in the world, the 6th spot in the Tasmanian legislature Senate seat on the basis of group voting tickets. And yet she was popular because people saw themselves represented in her as opposed to a normal politician. Don't you think that the comparative is one that people will be able to identify with and care about simply?
But you guys often don't get Jackie Lambie, and we are the team that gets more Jackie Lambies because by your own token, she is a popular person who you have incentives to elect, but also has incentives to, into your system, self-select out of the very democracy that you're trying to establish. So let's move into the area in this debate where things really fall apart for this team, and that is with respect to executive failure. We tell you, firstly, that there is just no expertise in relevant executive positions, people like the Attorney General, people like the Treasurer. They counter at second by saying, oh, well, we're going to allow you to vote for those people. But firstly, how do you know enough about that individual when literally hundreds or thousands of people are putting their hand up to be in that particular position? Like literally, how do you do that? How do you assess that? It's been an entire debate and no one has told me. But secondly, you have the same problems that you had before because the people who are most likely to put their names forward and to subsume those positions are wealthy, white, powerful men who say that they're the ones who have a law degree and so they should be the Attorney General. And therefore you get the exact same issue you guys were trying to combat because you shift all of that power into the same groups of people. The next thing they say, we tell you, is that they just have no background in doing very basic procedure, stuff like drafting legislation, which is extraordinarily complex, stuff like running Senate's estimates commissions, which is the job of these people. Their responses are a fewfold. The first is to say, oh, well, you get some experts. But firstly, sometimes you don't get experts within that particular field, people like for instance, family law. Second, sometimes they only represent a particular view in that field, like maybe you only get a more hardcore person rather than the other person. And third, they're often not the best placed person in that field. They then say, well, you get advisors. Right. Well, firstly, the power then shifts to those advisors in very negative ways. Second, you have to brief thousands of people in extremely difficult circumstances. Three, people often have their own viewpoints and want their own day in like Parliament, right? And all want to stand up and be able to debate the issue that they care passionately about. Their next response is to say the median person is smart. 35% of the US population think that Agrabah, the place from Aladdin, is a real place. It is difficult to consider, but unfortunately the reality is that there are incentives in place that push politicians to be educated and to have well-spoken ideas. There are forums like Q&A and public debates that require them to justify that and their intelligence. The third thing they say is that they elect a centralized leader. I've already pointed out that this is extremely unlikely, but also has its own litany of issues which replicate the issue that they are trying to combat. The third thing to say is that this is enormously time-consuming. You have more than 5 times, in some cases, standard parliaments. In the US, it's even more. You have debate on issues that last insane amounts of time because everyone wants to have their view. There are a series of different viewpoints. There's often highly technical viewpoints, like amending the Corporations Act, and there's also no centralized voting blocks like you get automatically through the party structure. And that means that government becomes a lot less efficient. And that's an ulterior way in which we won this debate, is which if you just believe that government was worse, government could do less and they could get less good work done. All of our argument about there being massive instability is not replied to. So that leads us to the final issue of loss of public faith. There are scattergun responses here. Jerry says it could be you. It's a 1 in 20,000 chance. No one takes that seriously and reads up on that basis. Second, people perceive it as being underrepresented for the reasons we described. And third, debates become messier because you have more people and it's harder to identify tangible people. Ben's final response is, you know someone there, but they, by our analysis, probably disprove of that system itself. At the end of this debate, this didn't work. It wasn't representative. It had a litany of extremely serious issues. Very, very proud to oppose.
Kia ora, thank you very much. As is traditional in this style, I would now like to welcome the negative leader.
I want to begin this reply with two observations. The first observation is a boring debating meta one, but check your notes and just observe how much of Ben's speech was new. There were new mechanisms, new parts of the model, new justifications for things that were never there in the case thus far. If you're impressed by Ben's speech, don't be, because he didn't do his job as a third and talk about the case as it was. Secondly, they push on us that we're not defending our burden of the status quo. But look at your notes and just see how bad we describe their world to be. Our world is broken, but their world is broken beyond repair. And that is the reason most clearly we win this debate. Let's start by talking about policy. Then we're going to talk about the distortion of money, of politics by money. And finally, we're going to talk about legitimacy. Let's start with policy. They basically give you one piece of positive material here. And they say you would increase representation in the government. We get over this in three ways. The first way is to just point to our current model. We can have quotas and our quotas achieve what they do symmetrically. And in some areas, they achieve even more because for people like the trans population, who they try to model in a different thing for its second, as they cannot do, we are able to have higher than proportional quotas for trans individuals. And their only response to this is to say, well, actually, in our world, those minorities will still be in power for a long time, so they will be corrupted by time. But the first thing I would observe about that is those minorities might be corrupted by time or whatever their mechanism was, but those minorities still care about the issues of their own group and still get the same representative benefits that these guys seek to get. So it's symmetric in that regard. But secondly, they just never step through why time corrupts you so. They only use an example of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and never explain why a long time in government would make you more likely to represent the interests of some oligarchical party that you feel some allegiance to, rather than just having more information about what is reasonable and about what is possible in Parliament, which is the first way we get over that only piece of positive material about policy, about representation. The second two were pieces of positive material we extend. The first one is by explaining that any policy benefits they can achieve are just entirely eroded by our explanation of inefficiency. The 70,000 Indians who will now make up the Indian legislature will not be able to get anything done, which means even if they can prove that this body would have all the good faith in the world, they don't know how to turn that into policy that meaningfully helps anyone. It is a limp system that can't do anything, which means they need to do more than explain to you that they would have good intentions, but that would be able to be executed in any way. And imagine how much worse that is made by the material we give you about engagement, because now these individuals who are in Parliament aren't only, the average Joe. They're a worse version of the average Joe because they have no engagement with the political process in any meaningful way. And the only reason they give you as to why people would say engage with the political process is they know it could be them. No, it couldn't. 1 in 20,000 are awful odds. It's not going to be you. And Ben's trying to shift at third to a new model where he's like, no, they would have months in advance to prepare and learn, isn't sufficient for legislatures of tens of thousands of people. The third way we get over it is explaining that corruption will exist. And their only way of getting over this is saying, well, you can't take bribes. No, you can. And in the places where it matters the most, it will be commonplace. And it is far harder to monitor on the scale, even if it is still to some extent easy to monitor. Let's talk about distortion of politics by money. The important thing to observe about this is extraordinarily under-impacted by these guys. There is no strong reason to believe that the distortion of politics by money is as bad as a government that cannot function in any meaningful way. So even if they win this point in its fullest, it just doesn't matter to this debate's result. But secondly, we explain that we are able to just fiat this mostly away. And they only point to other examples we give as to how this wouldn't work as opposed to explaining why this particular example we are unable to institute measures to get rid of. Finally, let's talk about legitimacy. As I explained from first, this debate doesn't really matter unless you believe that it is legitimate for a state to have complete control over its public without any strong accountability mechanisms. And they only ever say, no, it's representation that matters. That is not true. It is for the reasons I explain and they never bother responding to, which means not only is it principally illegitimate, but all the problems that Umrit, me, and Seamus describe about riots and backslides are likely to occur. You ought to oppose this motion.
Thank you very much for that speech and the entire negative team for their contribution to the debate. To finish the debate, I'd like to welcome the affirmative leader.
All right, thanks. Can I still be heard by everyone? Cool, thanks. There are two questions in this debate. The first is, would a lottery or an election better lead to governments that implement good policy? And the reason we're starting here is because it's here where our side showed that there were a number of serious problems inherent to elections, regardless of whether those elections were buttressed with strict affirmative action requirements, campaign finance laws, or not. To be clear, side affirmative in this debate does not believe that the negative team has the level of fiat that they claim they do, for reasons which we've elucidated earlier on in our case. But in this part of the reply speech, I'm going to take side negative at their best and assume they get all of that fiat. Our line of argument here was multifaceted. Among other things, we told you that during elections, politicians spend time on the campaign trail rather than doing the job of governance, that during elections you get pork barreling and appealing to the median and swing voter rather than creating policy which helps everyone in society, or that thirdly, institutions like political parties select people from a wealthy background or in a way which is beholden to factionalism and branch stacking. And the only mechanism there which was ever given a direct response was the third one, where they try to compare that to our world, which they say still is not representative, because, for instance, trans people and other individuals from small minority communities still would not get the requisite number of people represented in this parliament to push through legislation that they wanted. Notably, this line of argument cannot win side negative this point because it only mitigates our material and does not defeat it. Notably, the reasons why all of I'm going to kill you. There are a number of reasons why all of this material was so decisive in this debate. That firstly, it all stands regardless of quotas or campaign finance laws or any of the model stuff which side negative wanted to prop in this debate. And secondly, it has a deep impact on policy outcomes. The things in this debate which should be the metric of how the debate is adjudicated on, because they have deep and wide effects on everyone in society. So having established we get better policy on our side, I'm now going to turn my attention to the second question in this debate, which we think is also the less important question. And that is, which side provides a more efficient system of government? And the reason why we say this part of the debate was less important was because this part of the debate dealt with the expediency of getting policy passed, rather than whether or not the policy that does get through moves society in a positive or negative direction. That is to say, even at the worst case scenario for outside, where policy takes ages to get through, where it takes a long period of time to elect the treasurer, where there is immense debate, that would still be preferable to a status quo in which you get special interest and unrepresentative members of and party hacks having control over policy and moving society in a negative direction. The negative team's line of argument was that having a large legislature meant there would be difficulties in debate and appointing members of the executive. This line of argument had a number of problems which we point out throughout our case. That if you have problems with, for instance, how large the scale of our legislature is, that's fine, we can just scale it down. That's a model bash and not a positive piece of material which can win the negative team this debate. That secondly, we preempt this in our model, and we told you to be a 6-month period where problems with determining the executive and problems with learning how to engage in debate and policy are fleshed out. That thirdly, that we told you that you don't necessarily need certain members of the executive, that many countries do have large multi-member legislatures without clear leaders and extensive cabinets, and due to the culture which is created in that country, an argument which we bring up at second and doesn't actually get really, I think, responded to in this debate. There would be a way to ensure that this has expediency of policy, or that fourthly, our side is still comparatively much better because we still get better representation, and that was going to be more important. So, and notably, all of this means that a large swath of the negative team's case falls completely out. The end of this debate, The negative team relied on model bashing and failed to engage on the comparative. Our side has done entirely the opposite, and that's where we've won.
So that was an excellent debate to what that I hope concludes what you all feel was an excellent tournament. We will be in touch shortly via the University of Auckland Facebook page and through the WhatsApp. Once again, thank you to everyone who's taken part. Thank you to the teams. Thank you to the adjudication panel. Thank you to my flat's internet connection, which has often taken many, many, many separate debates being run live streamed at the same time. And I hope to see you all very, very shortly.